Yeah, this is the first of the year, so welcome. I know 2020 was one of those kind of crazy years, and I think I've had a couple conversations about the fact that everybody was looking forward to get out of 2020, and we get into 2021, and 2021 looks us square in the eyes and says, "Hold my beer." so so we are still firmly in the weird zone, but that's all right. Keeps things interesting. So for the power lunch today, we have George Corte uh, from Digital Nomads and NetVPro. We're going to give both credit there, but George is a security practitioner with Digital Nomads. And we're going to talk about SolarWinds. There's been a lot of ongoing uh, ramifications, if you will, ongoing effects of the SolarWinds, the recent SolarWinds breach. I think that we are still learning stuff about that, and George can bring us up to speed on what happened and some of the impacts, and kind of talk about some of the ongoing stuff involved with that. So, um, and again, I guess from a today perspective, we do not have the wheel of death going, but we do have the cards that everyone will get for their so they can go out and get their foot long. And then I guess based on our earlier conversation, you could toast up your foot long in your cast iron skillet if you want to. So we got tips and tricks on that. So, well, with that, welcome George. Thank you for coming, and turn over control.
Alrighty. Thank you very much, Keith and Paul, for inviting me to speak on this. Um, just to give a little bit of a rundown, this is a very complicated topic. There is a lot of moving pieces in it. What I'm going to be highlighting on is some of the higher level parts. I can get into some of the weeds if people have specific questions, but it's a lot of information. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to uh, put questions in the chat for Haley. We can do a formal question and answer at the end. But if something doesn't make sense, this is geared for a technical and non-technical audience. So some people, it may be over their heads. Don't be afraid to ask. Some people, you might be bored. Just stick with me and we'll get to the parts that you'll be looking for. So let me share the screen and let's see what we've got here. So do you guys see the presentation?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Well, basically, it was a little bit of gallows humor on my part because I took the one platform to rule your IT stack from SolarWinds' website. I'm a Tolkien fan, and it resonated with me. So we'll be discussing SolarWinds and then the sunburst and supernova exploits that kind of came from that. Let me just wanted to say thank you to NetVPro for putting this together. Since I was given a nice introduction by Keith, I'm going to skip through this part. So the photo looks a lot better than I do in person. So like I said, feel free to ask questions. We're not going to be using crazy technical lingo here. There will be a few terms, but I'll try to qualify those as we go. There are a lot of write-ups out there, and one of the slides at the end has a lot of sources that you can go to actually see a lot of the source material and places I gathered information from. So what we're going to be covering is basically what was the compromise, how were they compromised, what was the leverage points utilized, why did it take so long to detect, and how long was the actual exploit in their network for, and what can we do when our third-party vendors become compromised, and are there mitigations that are out there that we can utilize for our businesses. So this was a compromise that's known as a supply chain. A supply chain is anything that you rely on that is in a stepped process that delivers what you need. So a supply chain can be affecting a MSP, a HVAC company. They are in your supply chain supplying a service that you utilize. In this particular case, it was a supply chain against the customers of Solarwinds by injecting malicious code, a compromised DLL file, into the master software that they use to compile the products for the Orion platform. The compromise, because of the way that it was inserted, it was signed by SolarWinds. Now, a lot of software uses what are called signing keys. It's a way of validating that this is a legitimate program. And when you download and install software, you'll usually get a pop-up that'll say this is from Microsoft or this company or that company. When you're installing something, that is that validation of the signing key. Because these exploits were put in early, they were able to get signed as legitimate software, which slowed down people's ability to respond to them. The fact that they also did the supply chain, as in the source code for the Orion product, they were able to leverage SolarWinds' built-in software distribution system so that they only had to compromise the original source code, and it was automatically distributed and sent to all of SolarWinds customers. Last count, I believe it was 18,000 systems that were compromised by this, and that's just a rough estimate. It could be more, it could be less. We don't know for sure what the final number is, and we're still seeing some changes in that landscape. How was SolarWinds breached? I don't have any really good nitty-gritty details of someone left a bad password or anything like that. What it appears is that it was very well targeted to the systems that they developed their product on, and because of that, it was able to get inserted into their source code, and then it basically, without proper code review, became assumed as legitimate source code and got compiled right along with everything else. So unfortunately, the way that this ended up playing out was very well thought out and well crafted to be able to sneak it under the radar of a lot of systems that we already have in place, or controls that we would be utilizing to try to watch for malicious programs or software. When they were leveraging the breach, a couple things that are really key into this is that it was a very sophisticated attack. Further in this presentation, I'll kind of go in, but they had injected code into the SolarWinds base almost a year ago. Sorry, I didn't realize the pop-up on my screen was chats. I didn't have that window open. It was a sophisticated attack in the fact that they understood the build process at SolarWinds. They understood where was the vulnerable point. By injecting they basically, a year ago, they had put in code that was not active. It was just a null bit of code that doesn't do anything, but they watched it for over 6 months, from what we can tell, and it was still passed through. So they knew that the code was not being reviewed at that level so that they could inject the actual Trojan that they wanted to. So this leads us to believe that it was an actual customer of SolarWinds Orion platform that was using a very targeted attack for this. As you can see, this very much oversimplifies it, but it is the process. They got a compromise in their supply chain of their code development and packaging of their software, inserted their Trojanized DLL, and basically let SolarWinds take care of distributing it to all the clients. It was very well researched, and like I said, the knowledge of SolarWinds was enough that they must have had a very good foresight or visibility into their processes to be able to sneak this in and keep it from being detected. How long did it take? Well, if you go to the SEC website, they actually had to file a report on December 14th that basically said that the compromise was from March to June that the software was actually being infected and put out on their site for distribution. But like I had said before, back in December of 2019, they have gone back through their code review and found that there was a null insertion, just a, sleep command or something stupid, simple that would not ever trigger anything, but it was basically there so that they could decompile and see if it was getting caught or not. The code that they had written was very well written, and it was very professionally put together, which also did not make it stand out if someone was just doing a casual review. So this is where change management and such really didn't follow proper practices, in my opinion, for SolarWinds. They should have had proper code review, and they should have had some sort of ability to track that, hey, there's changes that we didn't make. The last bullet item was concerning a couple sources that I was able to find had confirmed that the compromised versions of the software were still available for download up to December of this last year. So even though it was identified and they say that the threat was only from March to June, they hadn't responded and cleaned up the distribution of their software till December to take it down. So in my opinion, that's too long of a wait for this type of an exploit. Why was it not detected sooner? Well, because of the fact that it was in their supply chain, it was already in a trusted position. It already was signed. It was an implied trust that we would assume that this has already been reviewed, this is safe software, so we would already be in a position to accept it. They also were masquerading the traffic as Orion's improvement protocol. So they basically used Orion's tool set to hide their traffic out within legitimate communication paths that Orion would use. So any IDS system would just see this as normal Orion traffic. Now, unless it was going to a destination that would have been flagged, it would have never triggered unless you were doing IDS monitoring, and IDS being intrusion detection services or systems. If you were doing IDS with a DNS filtering, then you may have gotten an early warning. But if you were strictly looking at the packet types and the data, it would have looked like legitimate Orion traffic going in and out of your network from that. They also leveraged it as an advanced persistent threat. Once the Trojan was out there, it waited for weeks before it did anything. It was a smart move from the standpoint of you're not going to raise a flag, because whenever you install something and something doesn't work right, immediately you look at what was installed. But if you wait for weeks or a month, now your memory isn't going to go back as far and say, oh, well, what's the change that we made that caused this problem? You're not going to think a month ago we did this. So that was a way for them to also keep their activity under your radar. And once they came out with a better exploit, as in Supernova and Sunburst, they were able to use their initial foothold to download these into your networks, and then they made their initial exploit inactive. So it would still be there, it wouldn't do anything, and it wouldn't do any activity because now they had a second way of control. So it was very well thought out, and this was not a plan of we're going to crack a network open and we're going to do a lot of stuff right away. This was well thought out, and this was a planned approach. This was not a this was for a longer term end game. Like I said, it would make itself inert. It basically had an intelligent kill switch, which also was beyond just making it inert. When it had downloaded its other packages that they deployed, it also would detect if it was in a sandbox. So if you set up a virtual environment, if you set up certain testing procedures to isolate a computer for the purpose of malware detection, this was intelligent enough that it would check and see if there was any indications of that, and if it saw anything, it would just shut itself off. So that made it harder to detect due to abnormal behavior, because as soon as it would launch from within the Solarwinds, because it was part of the source code, your indication would be what is it doing. And as soon as it would try to check on anything and it would find out I'm in a sandbox, it would just shut off and just sit there and say, nope, not going to do anything now. So that made another step of this. It made it another difficult hurdle to overcome. The code, like I said, was professionally written, and I guess I reused that bullet point again. But ultimately, what I'm trying to really get across is this was not a fly-by-night organization that put it together. This was definitely a team of professionals that knew what they were doing. When vendors are compromised, should we be as concerned? Well, if anyone knows what happened to Target, that's exactly how Target got compromised, was through vendor and overexposure of information to vendors that was used to be able to get into their systems. A couple of statistics here. 80% of the organizations that have had a breach that was caused by one of their vendors. We definitely need to be paying attention to what our vendors have access to, and are we asking the right questions of our vendors. 77% in a survey for CIO magazine was saying that most of the respondents didn't have much of any visibility into what those vendors had access to, what they were doing, what their activities were. In the cybersecurity space, a lack of information is more damaging than having too much. Too much information, yeah, you can get overwhelmed by it, but a lack, you don't know what is not covered, and you don't want to have that exploit come in from left field and catch you off guard because you thought that there was nothing there. Mitigations are really kind of difficult in this space. Proper oversight of your third parties' cybersecurity will pay dividends. It is definitely worth questioning your vendors, questioning your service providers that provide technology, HVAC, any of those services, and just ask, what do you have in place for protecting yourself and therefore me if something happens in your network, in your environment, if one of your employees has a data breach. The director of risk and compliance for Panorays, even I quoted him here, you can reduce the incident of a breach by 20 percentage points by just making sure you know, are your vendors doing the best that they can to try to protect themselves, or are they just, it's always worked this way, we're just going to keep doing it. You can also go so far as to request evidence of a third-party audit of your vendors, and beyond that, review it. Don't just have them send a report and say, okay, yeah, we had a audit by Joe down the street here. His son's in college for computers. Make sure that you get a copy of that result. Go through it with your team, or bring in someone that is familiar with it to go through it with you and explain what it is that was checked. Are there concerns in that audit? I'll just digress real briefly. I was dealing with one customer that had an HVAC vendor, and from the perspective of the vendor, they didn't care about the security of the business. They just wanted to have access to their controls. The way they wanted that was they wanted the web port open on the outside of the firewall, port forwarded to their control box. No security, no nothing. I connect to their firewall on port 80, and immediately I'm talking to their HVAC control box for the building. I didn't agree with that, but I also said, okay, I'm just curious about this. I went and typed in admin, and was in. Think about that. This was a HVAC for a building. What would happen if you knew that that building was closed over Christmas, or they shut down for a period of time, and you go in and turn off all their HVAC controls and all the water lines freeze in that building, or you do something like that, because you're basically controlling the response, the alerts, everything from that controller. You've got to keep those types of things in mind whenever you're dealing with any type of an external vendor and opening up access to them. Unfortunately, it went up the chain. The vendor didn't feel it was a problem. They felt it was more important for their techs to be able to sign in from home to any of their customers. And I don't work with that particular business anymore, because I don't want to have to be responsible for those types of things. So, mitigations that can help. Proper oversight of your third parties is going to definitely be your first step. Ask questions. Don't be afraid of sounding stupid. Don't be afraid of sounding paranoid. Ask and ask and ask. Yeah, the chat says it, don't use simple passwords, but also ensure that your vendors and outside contractors are forced to those same standards of no simple passwords. Request the evidence of an audit. I have gone so far as to see a business in Minneapolis that they had a vendor request a third-party audit of the business. So they were concerned enough that they said, we don't care if you say you're good. We want someone else to check and say you're good. Segment your network. Network segmentation can be very critical in helping reduce how far someone can get in your systems. I know that a lot of people are nervous about putting firewalls in between subnets and areas in that, but if you're in a high security business, that may be a requirement that you have. But keeping all of your networks separate instead of everyone on the same network segment, and when I talk about this, I talk about your IP addressing scheme. Don't put your servers, your printers, your access points, your workstations, your firewall all on the same IP scope. Basically, don't put them all on the same unmanaged switch. You want to have some way of breaking up that traffic so that if something was to happen in your workstation network, you might be able to get some indications as it tries to go to your servers. What you're looking for in network segmentation is creating choke points, places where you can control the traffic and know, is this legitimate, is this not? Typically, that's where you put your intrusion detection systems, is at those choke points between network segments. Utilize a zero trust architecture. Zero trust is a very good principle. It is a bit of effort to put in, but it is assuming that you have to prove yourself to me. It's basically 10,000 foot view. I have to authenticate you, authorize you, and continually verify that you have access. It's not a, oh, okay, yeah, you've got a shared password, you should be fine. It's, you are definitely putting in policies and procedures to make sure that everyone that does have access is being validated and confirmed that they should and still do. It also means that you're going to turn up your reporting and logging so that you do not have activities that don't generate some sort of machine data that can be looked at after the fact to either determine what happened or to be able to look at what is happening in real time. Regularly review your permissions and privilege for all user accounts and vendor accounts and even system accounts. A lot of times I see and it's no one in particular is not thinking of security, but what tends to happen is they are focused on trying to get things done quickly, so they will just use an account that they already know has privileges, and now that's the account that's tied to this service, and now that service, and the other service. Well, when you've got named accounts with privileges, those are potential areas that can be leveraged or exploited. Every service account does not have to have domain admin privilege. Every vendor does not need to have domain admin privilege. Keith can attest to one that he called me in on, that it was a crypto locker and they had a vendor account that had domain privilege on their network, and that's how it launched and crypto locked their network. You want to review those things. You want to make sure that those are not the practices that you are starting with, because it's easier to do that at the beginning than it is after something happens and try to reverse it. So why is the supply chain so important in this case? It is the best bang for their buck. With the constant reuse of source code, companies will reuse DLLs or existing files in their products. Microsoft is known for having certain DLLs that they've got consistent through multiple iterations of Windows. It's very similar to the concept of what happened with Solarwinds. They had a specific DLL. That DLL was then taken and maliciously modified, and that got used in their products. The source code review is not always properly performed to look for these changes. As a result, that source code could have been stopped right away if they had a good process to notify the developers of changes to those files. But because they didn't, as a result, they end up pushing this through their software process, signing it, and distributing it to 18,000 plus businesses. And if you want to have the I'm not going to sleep well as a result, as of the 2020.2 hotfix, I believe it is, or I'm sorry, hotfix 1, these are all the subsequent products of SolarWinds that are affected by that, not just the Orion, but these subsets. So maybe you don't pay for Orion, but you're using their enterprise operations console. This has the potential of also being infected. This is why a supply chain attack pays dividends for the attacker, because they got it in at a lower level, and that was rolled up into all of these subsequent products for them. So I know I have gone through a lot of material very quickly because I was not sure I would be able to get through this in the 45 minutes. Um, and I'm luckily I was able to get this done in about 35. So I am open to questions. Anybody has any curiosities, go right ahead and ask. As I had said, these are the links of resources for additional reading or information. As I said, if you're interested in further reading or if you need help falling asleep at night.
Anybody have any questions for George?
I think it came up in the chat, and I'm of the same opinion. I mean, I know they haven't disclosed it that it was an insider um, inside job. What have you found out more about that, or what are your feelings on that aspect?
In all honesty, if it is a inside job, that would make a lot more sense. I would say just based on what I've been able to find, and this is still more information keeps coming out as more eyes are looking at it. This was a longer term approach. Like I said, it's been over a year that they had put their original feelers into the code to see if it was getting filtered out. So we don't know how long before then access may have been provided into that network. I think that it was potentially an inside job, or else it was a exploit that they had a long lead time to be able to understand and learn how SolarWinds was doing their processes. But gut feeling is, I think they had help.
I think it's I don't know, maybe I'll say a cautionary tale. If you have vendors, that it is important to do a review of, if not their internal security practices, just how they plan to integrate with your systems. In past lives, I've had vendors that were, again, HVAC type organizations that want to access machines and have unfiltered access into those devices, which we had to say no to, but also video and security systems as well wanted to have access to internal systems. So understanding that it's okay to push back on those and say no, and we can find secure ways to access. But I think that, it's kind of illustrates that, you know having third parties with access to your environment can be a spooky thing. And 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 if and if you are a vendor, if you I don't know everybody who's on the call, but if you're a vendor and you provide those types of services, I think that it's very valuable to be able to talk about your security controls and explain that to your customers, because in a lot of ways that can be turned into a competitive advantage.
Yeah. In all honesty, when you look at what vendors are looking for, look at it from this perspective. Would you give the key to your house to somebody just because you want to be able to have them check your furnace a few times a year? I would rather them call me. I would rather know that they're showing up and be there to escort them than just give them a key and assume that everything's going to be fine. I can trust that they've got this key even if it gets lost.
One of the things, and again, in past life that was very interesting is, in our environment, we had an SSA 16. So we had a third party come in and assess our security controls. And they did a third party attestation to our security controls, which was, it was a great process, great learning, but it was painful. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it was a painful process. But one of the things that the audit team did, and I'll say auditors don't have a great sense of humor, but the audit team did, was, we would have a control or a practice in place, and it would be like, well, you know, Susie has access to this. And then a good question is, well, what if Susie turns evil? Okay, that's the question. And as we think through kind of how the Solarwinds thing occurred, and even though it hasn't kind of hit the public space as far as anybody turning evil, but if you have a bad actor inside and they do turn evil, just the degree of vulnerability that they can expose a business to is noteworthy. So again, a handy thing that I found in the past is, okay, well, you know, Bob walks the straight and narrow. Bob's a great guy, but you know, in his role, what if Bob turns evil, and what things can he impact? And from a security perspective, understanding that and thinking about things that way will really help you out. You know, I'm sure that your HVAC vendor really doesn't want to provide a channel for the bad guys into your environment, but could they? You know, and those are the things that you want to try to, you know, get your arms around and limit as much as you possibly can.
You are going to be looking for threats, internal and external, all the time. And I don't mean to be picking on HVAC, but those are just two that are very easy to overlook because you think, well, why do I have to worry about a HVAC vendor? But when they have access to your network, they can, even if it's not the HVAC vendor, but it's someone else using their privileges, it's a pivot point. Once they get in, they can pivot that into other systems.
And honestly, George, yeah, we do a lot of work with the manufacturing space. And when you think about HVAC, we think about video security, but you think about those organizations that help manage devices. So if you have an automated line and the vendor wants to come in, you know, and a lot of times those vendors could be from foreign countries, you know, just to understand that what it seems like just an automated packing line or assembly line is really being accessed from somebody who might be in Germany or some other country, and you know, knowing what is real access versus not real access, or what is normal versus not normal access, is also an important thing to think about here too.
Yes.
I have a theory on the whole target thing.
Mhm.
Nothing really to back it up, but except maybe some logic.
You
Is
blaming
that,
Walmart? Walmart did it, right?
yeah, the Target, when Target was hacked, they had software in place that they spent a lot of money on that actually did detect it. I think they made a business decision 3 days before Black Friday that they weren't going to do anything about it and thought it would be cheaper in the long run to deal with it in the past, you know, once it was over, and not lose all that business because they couldn't shut down their POS system.
Yeah. I've heard a variation on that as well, Ken, that the official statement that I had heard, and I'm using the quotes liberally, was that it was in a beta mode. They were still fine tuning it to make sure that it was ready for production. So I think that there was a little
alerts.
I know, and someone should have been looking at those alerts as part of their tuning, but I think someone was wordsmithing it to make it sound a little better. But
yeah,
I mean, I don't know how many people have dealt with intrusion detection systems. When you install one, they chatter up a storm because you don't know what the thresholds are for your network. What your job is to be reviewing all of those to find out what is legitimate, what is not, before you block it, so that when you turn the blocking on, it's blocking what you need it to. Because if you just turn it on right away, you cripple your network.
Yeah, when we first put one back in a leasing company I worked for at the time, the email alerts were just bombarding my email box. And you would have to go through them and say, okay, this really isn't something to worry about. And then these are.
Yep.
It took a while to fine tune it. And finally, we hired an outside company just to monitor the alerts and, you know, dig through that and get their algorithms on it.
Yeah, I did that at a financial firm, and it was about 2 weeks of hell. I don't really remember sleeping much, but I had to go in and set all the exemptions of it was from this source to that source or that destination. Fragmentation over VPNs was triggering alerts, a lot of stuff, but doing that due diligence helps protect you for the next time, so that you know what does get alerted is more than likely not just normal traffic. So you're getting the value of that product.
Awesome. Are there any other questions for George? If not, thank you everybody for your time today. Good to see you.